All right, we are live. So here we go in 3, 2, 1. What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Sports Medicine Broadcast. I am your host, Jeremy Jackson. I've got Shawn Reedy and one of his doctors, Dr. Paul Saenz, who's a team physician for the San Antonio Spurs. So the Sports Medicine Broadcast is a podcast to promote and improve your practice as an athletic trainer, and that's just what we're going to try and do today as Dr. Saenz talks about when sports science and sports medicine converge. This podcast will be eligible for CEUs once the audio version is released. You can go to sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/sports-science. Again, sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/sports-science, and that'll have the links how do you get to the CEUs, or you can go to sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/CEU, and you can take the courses that are available now. So thank you, Shawn Reedy, for hooking us up with the CEU certificates, the CEU eligibility. And Dr. Saenz is going to be introduced real quick by Shawn, and then we'll get right to it. Shawn?
So Dr. Saenz is one of the primary care sports medicine physicians here in San Antonio with SMASA, Sports Medicine Associates, San Antonio. He was one of the first primary care sports medicine physicians in the city, I believe, and he's worked with, obviously, the Spurs, but many Olympic games, Olympic teams, many of the colleges here throughout the San Antonio area, and we are lucky enough at Methodist that we get to work with him quite often when we're doing some physicals and things of that sort. So,
thank you, Shawn. Well, thank you for having me here with you guys today and the whole audience out there. And I want you to take just a second to glance at the title slide there, because it has somewhat of a little Darwinian approach here to the theme of the talk today. And really, it's a little bit of a personal speak as to how my own role as a team physician has seemed to evolve over the years. And, you know, we're all involved in the game of sports medicine, and that allows us to interface with athletes and teams. And the whole nature of this is the competitive nature of sports. And so the talk essentially is the substance of the talk will be looking at the way that workloads that are imposed upon athletes ultimately may affect their performance. Consideration also to the risk of injury. And we all know that along with injuries comes success, individual success or team success is highly dependent upon injuries. So I think this is something very germane to all of us. And I'll advance now. And we know that historically the team physician has been involved in the day-to-day care of athletes, and that the particular focus has really been on managing and recognizing athletic illnesses and injuries, and then prescribing a treatment for that. Yet the evolution of all of that, and I include not just team physicians, but all those that are involved in the care of athletes, and certainly the athletic trainers are the eyes and ears of the team physician. So the essential requirements of today's team physician and athletic trainers includes not only an understanding of sports medicine as we've traditionally been trained, but now an understanding of sports science derived metrics and analysis of those metrics that are being utilized to monitor athletic performance and injury prevention. And essentially doing that by looking at workloads imposed upon our athletes. So there's a whole cadre of tools and a suite of tools that are now available for those of us monitoring athletic performance. And it's now really part of our responsibility to extract that information that's derived from, whether it be high-speed motion cameras like the cameras that are in place at every NBA arena. We know that GPS technology has found its way into managing and assessing data and data collection of athletic workloads. There's things in place like force plates that can be used to measure strength, that can be used to measure baselines, recovery from injury. Physiologically, we may look at saliva, and we know that by extracting certain biomarkers from saliva, we can get somewhat of a status on the athlete's level of fitness, fatigue, recovery, etc. And then on the psychological end of the effect that workloads have on athletes, there are wellness scales that we can give to our athletes on a routine basis to see how they're feeling in response to the workloads. The San Antonio Spurs really, and my association with them over the last 21 years, has been a period of professional growth for me. And I can tell you that the Spurs have always really been on a leading edge and cutting edge in the area of exploration of the various aspects that would enhance athletic performance. So the Spurs way of doing things is to really look at best practices around the globe. And I can tell you that the logos that you see here, whether it's FC Barcelona Soccer Club, the New York Giants Football Club, the New Zealand All Blacks rugby team, Melbourne Australian Rules Football, Manchester United, all of these organizations have had open discussions and very frank discussions and shared intellectual knowledge and intellectual properties with the Spurs. And so I can tell you just that there's been a significant evolution in the application of sports science to our NBA club. So now, where it simply once upon a time was team doctors and athletic trainers, the staff has just markedly expanded to where a team physician is usually, you have both an orthopedic team physician and really a primary care sports medicine physician. And if we will follow the ways of Europe and how things are done in Australia and places that have really led the charge in sports science, the primary care sports medicine tends to be designated as the head team physician, and orthopedic surgeons are being utilized as consultants. And, you know, it's kind of been the reverse of the way things started in the States. But the role has certainly expanded for primary care sports medicine doctor, and all 30 NBA teams have doctors that completed fellowships in primary care sports medicine, in addition to the orthopedists on the sports medicine team. We now have directors of medical services, and in our organization, that's a physical therapist with a PhD. Interestingly, a lot of these individuals are from different parts of the world. Our director of medical services is South African. Our applied sports scientist is another PhD and possibly the smartest person I've ever run into in the sports medicine world. And he is from Spain. So, you know, there is an international flair that seems to be taking place with regards to the formation of professional sports medicine teams. Our director of rehabilitation is a physiotherapist from Canada. Of course, we have a cadre of athletic trainers, and they still serve as the backbone and primary interface directly with our athletes and the primary intermediary between our athletes and our coaches. And we have several athletic trainers, a head athletic trainer and several assistant athletic trainers. Strength and conditioning coaches, a head strength and conditioning coach, and several others. We just about fill a whole bus by ourselves with just our sports medicine team. Sports psychologists, sports nutritionists who are registered licensed dietitians, and then just the cadre of whether you're going to bring on other specialists. We've had people that tell us how we ought to sleep. There's really no limits to the resources that are explored that may, in essence, bring about a better performance of individuals and team. Why is it we want to monitor athletes? You know, what's the payback from this? Well, you're able to give players direct feedback. And I think, you know, athletes realize, I think for the most part, especially when they've reached a relatively high level, collegiate and beyond, that you get what you put into it. And so that their capabilities and their efforts should ultimately result in improved performance. But I often say the athletes walk the fine line between the workload that they absorb and their performance. So there are some parameters that we try to keep track on there. Injury prevention, of course, is one of the main reasons why we want to accumulate this data and see if there are concrete relationships that we can draw by looking at workloads and then assessing a risk of injury. It's all about achieving optimal performance. And I think that's easy for us to all understand, that as injuries go, so go the success of the team. And so for those in individual sports, cross country runner or a track and field athlete, it's more individualized, whereas our team sports, such as soccer and American football, basketball, etc., all of these are things that we look at globally as individual performance then translates to team performance. If you have these baselines, much in the way we have baselines for concussion testing, it allows us then, when our athletes are recovering from injury, to look back at that baseline and make some determinations about the reliability and our confidence level in being able to say that an athlete is capable of returning to play. And then lastly, and this is very important, is we can give our coaches feedback on the state of fitness, the state of perhaps fatigue of a individual athlete or a group of athletes collectively, so that coaches now can alter their individual player loads and make some adjustments in their practice schedules, etc. So we all know that when we look at athletic performance, that it involves several different facets, and strength and aerobic capacity, the level of nutrition that the athlete is willing to commit to. Recovery methods is just a huge area. And it is really very, very well documented that after a significant workload, that athletes need sufficient recovery time. And we've changed our vernacular within the Spurs organization from the word rest to recovery. And so instead of a coach saying at the end of the game, okay, we've had 4 games in 5 nights and tomorrow's an off day, we will now use the terminology that tomorrow's a recovery day. And so it encourages athletes to not only get their necessary sleep, but also to look for the various recovery means. And we'll touch base on some of these. Sleep, of course, is an excellent form of recovery and is something that every athlete should strive to obtain, and that's adequate amounts of sleep. Psychological wellness, and we can look at psychological profiles, and you simply just pose questionnaires to athletes, and they do get a little tired of filling them out on a daily basis, and they're liable to say feel fantastic, or they're liable to say they feel lousy. But you do have to take that into the perspective of your understanding of that individual athlete, because they may be giving you clues that physiologically they're wearing down by some of the answers or responses to the questionnaire. What is it we really want to monitor? We really want to look at the volume and intensity of work that we're imposing on our athletes during their training periods and then their competitive periods, their games. We want to look at their performance markers, and the strength and conditioning coaches will, of course, have baselines on athletes' strengths as they come into camp, and then what's the response over time. So we want to look at aerobic capabilities, and then we want to look at strength markers. We want to look at an athlete's ability to recover from injury. I'm sorry, not from injury, but from workloads, and get a relative assessment of their level of fatigue or wellness. And ultimately, this then affects player availability. So again, that feedback with the coaches so that they know how to do individual tailoring of workouts. It's not unusual that for some players, we will do what's now called workload management, and maybe give that player a day off or a day of recovery instead of engaging in a team workout. So when we look at loads, they are categorically divided into external loads and internal loads. And very simply, an external load is really what we're throwing at the athlete. What physical load will the player have incurred, and not only over a single session, but cumulatively over time. And that leads then to us establishing something that we'll talk about in a second called the acute versus chronic workload risk. So this is really, again, just the measurements, the way of monitoring that is out there for determining what it is externally that's been applied to the athlete. Internal loads then are how have they responded to those external stressors or external loads from a physiologic nature, from a biologic nature, which includes the physiologic changes, but also consider internal workload, has to consider the psychological effect on the athlete as well. So an external load, again, is defined as the work completed by the athlete, and it's measured independently from those internal characteristics. And using an example that is maybe a little esoteric, looking at it from the perspective of a road cyclist, but there's ways to get an athlete on a bike and do specific power output measurements and being able to calculate that down to a particular wattage. So again, it's looking at ways of quantifying that external load. For somebody in the gym who's doing bench press, it might be simply that they're ripping out 200 pounds, 10 reps, and then that equates to a number, and we can monitor that number over time. Internal workload, again, physiologic and psychological stresses imposed by the effort that are measured now with physiologic markers such as heart rate, RPE, the rating of perceived exertion, a scale of 1 to 10, and then things that we can look at serologically, such as lactic acid in the blood. We can look at cortisol, testosterone, and inflammatory biomarkers either through serum or through even salivary mechanisms. So categorizing some of these external load monitors, there's time motion analysis. And I mentioned that in every NBA arena, there's digital video cameras, high-speed cameras recording every single movement made by the athlete going north, south, east, or west. On the limitation within a closed arena is that you can't get all of the information that can be extracted from GPS tracking like you could in an outdoor setting such as the soccer pitch. But nonetheless, there's valuable data. We would easily be able to tell you that our point guard ran 3.8 miles and our big man ran 2.1, and you can readily understand that there's a big difference between that. The amount of minutes played, a player gets in the foul trouble, etc. All of that is data that can be extracted and then extrapolated across very different leagues, etc. In the NBA in particular, they would not allow for accelerometers, which are devices that are attached typically to a jersey, about smaller than the size of an iPhone. And they're not allowed, but yet our developmental league or our Gatorade league would allow us to do that. So we can use the data extracted from the point guard playing a similar number of minutes to our NBA guard and utilize that information interchangeably. Another form of external load monitoring is the force plates, which is more a measure of neuromuscular function. So it can be utilized to monitor strength over time, or it's particularly helpful in looking at an athlete, maybe he's complaining of patellar tendonitis, and you do force plate evaluations and you could see an asymmetry. And so it allows you now a goal of directing the rehab and ultimately being able to visualize correction of the problem. So SportsView is that player tracking system that I told you in basketball arenas. It creates statistics that measure distance and average speed of all the movements by a player on the court. And so that's one quantifiable, objective way of measuring, external loads. the Catapult System, and this is an accelerometer, and I look at how small it is and how easy it can be attached to a player's jersey or singlet. So it's a wearable system, and it monitors elapsed exercise over time, distance covered, the pace, so periods of high-speed acceleration and lower levels of acceleration, and can measure now the up-down movement of a player. Again, it's not as applicable when you are in all settings. For example, the NBA may use it in a practice setting, but not in a game-like setting. And these numbers are now obsolete because I did this talk, I think, originally in like 2017. So forget about those numbers. You could probably put a multiple of 10 across all those because everybody's utilizing these systems now. Now, I don't mean for anybody to try and pick this apart, but I want to show you that these are the kind of things that end up in my email box every single day during the season. And what I'm not showing you on the far left of the screen would be the players' numbers, but we would be going down the row here, and either alphabetically or by their number, you can see the number of games played in the last game, which was looks like in 2016, February 3rd, we played the New Orleans Pelicans, and we won that game 110-97. And it's broken down thereafter, and it looks at how many players at the very top left of the screen. You'll see that player played 33 minutes, and the guy at the very bottom played 26 minutes, and somebody came in some garbage time and got just a few seconds in, and nonetheless, so we then accumulate a season average. We then look over the minutes played, and we're in that category to the left. We'd look at the minutes played over the last 5 games. We compare the last 5 games over the previous 15 games. And then our sports scientists will use the metrics derived from the sports view cameras to develop what acceleration loads there were. And again, comparing those from last game to season average to last 5 games, last 15 games, and then looking at the total acceleration load. Again, just data that's extrapolated from one level to the next. And thank God that there are sports scientists that are calculating all this, or I wouldn't have a real practice probably. It's broken down to the nth degree. So now we look at those distance coverage, and we know distance times speed, is looking at acceleration, and distance over time rather is speed. And so you can now take down and break down the time that an athlete spent at running greater than 7.5 miles per hour, as you see in the far left category. In the middle category, we see that there's time spent at very high intensity speed, which is greater than 11.2, and then looking at that acceleration as it translates to the athlete's load. So it's data. A lot of it, we feel like you throw it against the wall and you see what sticks and what's really applicable. These are what our force plates look like in our gym, and there's a variety of jumps that will have the athlete jump from a platform and land on both legs at the same time, land alternately from one leg to the other leg, counter jumps, etc. And so we want to see the force perhaps upon which the athlete lands, and then we want to see maybe the force generated as they're standing on the platform and bounding onto a workbench, etc. Okay, so flipping now, having talked about a couple of means of assessing external load, we look at the internal load. What effect did that external load have on our athlete? So one way is by doing the RPE scale, the rating of perceived exertion. We can simultaneously, during the time that an athlete is working out, we can have them wear a heart rate monitor. These can't be performed or utilized during game activities in the NBA and in many other professional level sports, but they are capable of being applied during practice sessions, And sometimes in the minor league level, we're able to utilize them as guinea pigs, so to speak, to extract this data, the HRR, heart rate recovery. We're able, as I mentioned, to via saliva to assess things biochemically and hormonally and immunologically by extracting saliva or blood. We monitor, of course, a player's weight. There's some testing such as the Adductor Squeeze, which has been a predeterminant of fatigue and weakness involving the adductor muscles, so important to the exercising athlete. Dorsiflexion lunge is a way of looking at ankle dorsiflexion and determining whether there is a return from what should be considered normal. And you may see deficits in this after an athlete becomes fatigued because of inflexibility of the calf. Excuse me. Isometric muscle testing will show you what's called a NOR board. Functional testing can be done, reaction times, jump height, speed. Acetography is actually measuring sleep patterns and the wearables that athletes can put on, and you can look at their sleep patterns and how many awakenings they had during the course of the night, etc. The RPE scale is a 1 to 10 scale, self-determined assessment of exercise intensity, where total load becomes based on the rating of perceived exertion 1 to 10 times the duration in minutes. The RPE can correlate well with heart rate during steady state exercise. So again, wearing the heart rate monitor while you're running an athlete through. Oftentimes this is best done, for example, on a cycle ergometer or on a treadmill. And so you can just have the athlete run to the point of near exhaustion, and along the way they're telling you, okay, I feel fine, it's a 4, or I feel an 8, and you know they're probably getting near the point of exhaustion. And at the same time, while you're measuring heart rate, you can be drawing blood. And so then you can correlate the lactic acid buildup with that rating of perceived exertion and that athlete's training heart rate. So now you get an athlete who's wearing a heart rate monitor and they're out on the court, and you can try to correlate then with what you've done in the lab with what their level of fitness for continued work is, or whether it's time to quickly back them off because they're reaching a level of fatigue. And that level of fatigue, of course, we would correlate with increased injury risk. Cardio recovery, very important for our aerobic sports, of course, and there's a linear relationship between your heart rate and the rate at which you consume oxygen. And so the higher the ability to consume oxygen, the greater the fitness level of the athlete. So good correlate there for oxygen consumption and rating the level of aerobic fitness. Heart rate recovery is the rate at which a heart rate declines after exercise is terminated. So a very fit athlete who's very autonomically tuned and has a high fitness level will quickly return to their baseline heart rate. And those in which you maintain an elevated heart rate for a sustained period of time, conversely indicates that their fitness level is not as optimal. We look at markers of fatigue versus fitness, again, via saliva. The yo-yo intermittent recovery test is a cadence test that was very popular among European sports and soccer players, but it is a method of doing field testing forms of aerobic fitness. So not necessarily having to put everybody on a treadmill and hooked up to an oxygen measuring device. So this is that yo-yo test, short, intensive 40-meter runs with brief recovery periods, 10 seconds typically in between, ideal for sports with intermittent bouts of intensity such as soccer and basketball. So soccer, we know that your midfielders are going to be the players that are going to run essentially most of the game. Defenders may not always run when there's no activity on their end of the pitch, and same with a goalie, for example. With basketball players, we know that there's time on the court, then you return to the bench. There's free throws, there's timeouts. And so a yo-yo recovery test may be a little more valid than somebody who's going to get on a treadmill and run to the point of exhaustion, because that's just not the way those athletes typically engage in their sport. But it is valid assessment of cardiovascular fitness and as is heart rate recovery. Our biomarkers, testosterone and cortisol, correlate, of course, with levels of wellness and levels of fatigue. So the higher the testosterone level, there's a typical correlate there with a level of wellness and readiness. Let me use that term, readiness for exercise. Whereas cortisol, which is produced by the adrenal glands above the kidneys, is a measure of stress to the body. So the higher the cortisol level we see, there's a correlation there between an anabolic state where the testosterone level would be high and a catabolic state where your cortisol levels would be high. There's enzymes that we can monitor, such as creatine kinase, that are evidence of muscle breakdown. Myoglobin can be extracted from serum or can be extracted even from urine as an indicator of muscle breakdown. So we know that in an athlete, for example, with rhabdomyolysis, that the CK and the myoglobin just go off the charts because of the intense muscle breakdown. And of course, we hope not to incur that if we're imposing a workload upon an athlete for which they are able to endure. But we do see a variety of factors, typically in the summer months, when we have the cofactors of high heat and humidity. That's something we run into in our summer months as we engage in high school and collegiate football down here in Texas. And then there are these markers of inflammation, such as interleukin, alpha amylase, and these all can be extracted from saliva. MMP, which is matrix metalloproteinases, and tissue inhibitors of matrix metalloproteinases are enzymes that are indicative of cartilaginous destruction. So good things to monitor for monitoring the effects of workload on a player's joints. Again, more graphs, and this is our biomarker graph, and just the correlation of how you can look at salivary osmolality, and an increase in that demonstrates an athlete that may be in a dehydrated state. I mentioned interleukin-1 and its role with inflammation. This is very, very cogent information in the management of osteoarthritis, for example. Alpha amylase and its decline is indicative of a low state of the immune system. Troponin, myoglobin, indicators of muscular damage. So again, somewhat of a repeat of what I just talked about in the previous slide. So going again to looking at some of the internal monitoring, the effects of the workload internally, physiologically, biomechanically on the athlete, a high level of evidence that reduced hip adductor strength is related to injury. This is done with a sphygmomanometer, a blood pressure cuff, so bilateral isometric contractions into a pre-inflated cuff, and looking at those compared to a baseline. Predisposition to groin injury, and well studied in European soccer players. Just kind of an overview of what our weight room looks like. A lot of free weights, a lot of cycle ergometers. Perhaps in that right hand corner of the screen, trying to put my arrowhead there, there is an Alter G. So you're probably all familiar with that. That's a treadmill in which you're able to pneumatically reduce workloads, so that you can reduce essentially the force of impact by reducing a player's body weight by unloading them pneumatically. How about recovery methods? I mentioned that recovery has become a very, very hot topic in the area of management of workloads and reducing injury risk. So we think that if an athlete has been imposed to a big workload and or we start to get some markers that perhaps their cortisol level is increased, their adductor squeeze demonstrates that it's also decreased in comparison. And then we go and we look at their metrics and we see that this athlete has had an increased workload, played greater minutes, perhaps because of injury to the person that was starting in front of them that got injured, or that was given a day of recovery, et cetera. All different kind of variables there. But we may have that athlete come back into the gym and engage in a light cardio workout. We like to have them have their tissues worked on manually. Cryotherapy, of course, has become very, very popular as a recovery method. Pulse compression, aquatic therapy, all these things that I know your athletic trainers that are listening in have applied to their athletes. So we have, whole body cryo chambers where you get exposure to cold or dry air anywhere between minus 100 degrees Celsius, minus 140 degrees Celsius for anywhere between typically 90 seconds to maybe up to 2 minutes. Decreases tissue temperature comparable to traditional forms of therapy, but over a larger surface area. So it's generally then going to be more easily tolerated than cold water immersion. While athletes can typically tolerate things like ice baths or maybe getting all the way up to their waist in a cold water tub, it's a little bit more difficult to tolerate for the extended period of time as getting up into their shoulder level or neck level. We do know that cryotherapy, whether it's by cold water immersion or whole body cryotherapy, does have a benefit effect on the autonomic function and the ability to reduce edema and in either affect positively or negatively a vasoconstrictive or vasodilatory situation. So here's a cryo unit that the Spurs have on hand, and that's the big budget that professional teams can endure. That's about a $50,000 unit, and try to make sure that our athletes are utilizing this as a form of active recovery. We talked about this sequential gradient compression garments such as the Normatec that employ a pulsing dynamic compression to mobilize fluids and metabolites from the extremities back up to the heart. And these are applied post in high intensity workouts, very, very commonly seen during an athlete who's played this game and jumping on the plane that night. So it's convenient for air travel, or they can have them applied right post game, right in the training room or recovery areas. And here's an example of what they look like. Aquatic therapy, of course, here, this is a SwimX, so the underwater treadmill device. That's you can see the white platform below. And so athletes can participate in aqua jogging, or they can swim against a current applied in the SwimX here in the Spurs aquatic area. There is the Alter G that I spoke of earlier. Forgot that I had a close-up of that. Various forms of aerobic exercise. Players don't have to run. They can use a Versa climber. They can get on a stationary bike. They can get on an elliptical. The NordBoard, again, used extensively in Europe, looking at soccer players and our age-old nemesis, the hamstring strains. So these are many sensors that assess hamstring strength eccentrically and shown to be an effective method of training as well. So you apply a wireless isokinetic dynamometer, and you're able to determine athletes' baselines and measure their ongoing health of the hamstrings over the course of the season. So obviously very germane to acceleration, deceleration sports. So there's this myriad of tests that are out there, and unfortunately there's no single test that's going to give us all the answers. So we have to choose tests that are relevant to the sport. And choosing a method of doing external and internal load monitoring is going to be completely different for a cross-country runner and an American football player or a football soccer player. So you must find those that are more relevant to your sport. They have to be practical to implement. You can get the most sophisticated machinery that should give you, spit out the best data for you and accumulate to you, but if it's impractical to implement, then it's not money well spent. Choose tests in which they are most reliable, and as you study things that come onto the market, look for reliability. Do not look for anecdotal reports that well, this is used by this athlete or that athlete. Look for the data, find the data, ask for papers, and make sure that this device that you're looking at has been reliably tested in the market, that there are numbers to validate its use and its applicability. And then you want to choose tests that allow you to look at that and then produce actionable data. So what is it I can now take to my strength coach? What is it that I can now take to my coach and explain to them that this is the reason why this athlete maybe needs to undergo a reduced workload or an increased workload because they just haven't been getting active minutes. We run into that a lot with the players that just fill out the end of our bench and don't see a lot of game minutes. So in order to keep them up to speed, we often have to arrange for pickup games for them with our video staff and other members so that we can keep them up to a level and make sure that they don't decline as a result of deconditioning and inactivity. Equally important. So the key points to make all this effective is to make sure that your athletes understand why they're being monitored. When we first brought this into our team, it was not necessarily well received by those players that didn't have any exposure to it. Interestingly, the international players were used to it and were essentially demanding it. And I can remember the good old days, and things were a lot easier to manage. And for a lot of years, Spurs did very well. We were up at the top of the league in the number of games missed, meaning that's the fewest games missed. So, and I can remember that we were doing this without all of this sports science. And so we've had some years in the last couple of years where our injury rate has gone up, and it's not entirely understandable, comprehensible, but I can tell you this is staying around. So I think it's necessary for all of us to come up to speed and be able to speak the language and have some at least general understanding. Make sure your athletes understand why they're being tested, so that ultimately it's about maintaining their careers, maintaining the livelihood of their careers, and not pushing them toward a category of injury risk. Very simply, we'd like our players to stay in the green zone, right? And so if you can keep players out of the yellow zone, in which you have some concern, and definitely out of the red zone, then we believe that we can keep them in a level where we're reducing their injury risk. Your coaches have to understand. I mean, there's no sense getting all this unless there is complete buy-in by the medical staff, coaching staff, and the athletes themselves. And, you can't dabble in it. You just can't decide you want to do it this week and not do it the following week. It calls for consistency. And again, this is not really my job as the team physician, especially somebody who's in private practice. It's really interesting in Europe and in South Africa and Australia. The team physicians are typically employed by the organizations, and that's not typically the case here in the United States, where most doctors are out in private practice or university practices and then take care of those teams as well. Use the tests and the data that will allow you to make clinical decisions about player health. That's probably the most important thing of all. So why really, why do we want to maximize player and team performance, and what is it really that causes us to look at the sports science and look at external and internal loads so seriously and try to use those ratios to determine injury risk? It's I think all about this, right? It's all about the competition. It's all about teams seeking the competitive edge, um, finding when you can reduce injury, keep players available, optimize their fitness levels, monitor and reduce their fatigue levels. We all know that injuries are part of the game, and that luck is a really big part of it. I think it's also, if you look back and you go, well, did Michael Jordan have all this available to him? Did Magic Johnson have all this available to him? And they were superstars in their own right. Um, it's a tough question to answer, because we know that there's a certain it factor in all elite athletes, that they have this ability. There's genetic factors, there's psychological factors of how athletes will push themselves and the drive that they maintain. So really, I think we're at the end of the discussion on this topic, and it's been great to deliver this information to you. As I mentioned, this has really been an area of professional growth. Probably, if you'd have asked me when we started exposing ourselves to this 6 or 7 years ago, if I really enjoyed doing this, no, not really at the time. But again, it has created a level of understanding for me, and it now is the metrics that we look at. And we do sit around in our team meetings, which are typically led by our director of player personnel and player health. And there are some very, very educated individuals in the room trying to make decisions about everything from, is this a player we should draft? Is this a player that we allow to progressively return to play or not? I mean, very, very big and interesting, and sometimes multi-million-dollar decisions are being made utilizing these metrics. So I don't know if the format at this point, Shawn and Jeremy, is to take any questions. If that is something we can do, then great. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes.
One of the main things I wanted to say, Dr. Saenz, is obviously this isn't one of the reasons I liked the topic, but wanted to kind of pick your brain about it, was that, sorry, my notes just went away on me here, was that I want to go through, this obviously isn't the world of the high school athletic trainer. This, I mean, sometimes isn't even near the world of the collegiate athletic trainer. But one of the great things about what all you're doing in the NBA and you're doing and they're doing in, especially like you said, in international soccer and different places like that, is they're doing a lot of this testing. So we can actually pull numbers. We can get a lot of information. We can get a lot of this stuff to which we can then apply to our high school athletes. Now, that being said, it can also be a burden on us as the high school athletic trainer or the middle school athletic trainer. So because you get the coach that says, oh, we're going to do this because this is what the Spurs are doing, or we're going to do this because this is what SAFC is doing, or the Dynamo, or whomever. But how do we apply what we're finding, what we're utilizing in this recovery model / in this sports science model in our high school and maybe smaller collegiate athletes and such?
That's really an excellent question, Shawn, and forgive me to some degree about really not trying to extrapolate this to all different levels of competition, because you're right, some of this stuff is actually not going to be readily available unless you're at the collegiate level and beyond. So, again, we talked about really what's the concept of team, and in particular the sports medicine team, And the athletic trainers really are always really the bridge between the athlete and the coaching staff. And the more that an athletic trainer can educate themselves and credential themselves to bring relevant information to the coaching staff, I know here in San Antonio, we really try to endorse our athletic trainers to our coaches 100%, especially based on those athletic trainers that have taken a real special interest, be it in rehab or in sports science. And so it takes that really collegiality, it takes that mutual respect, where you bring information to them that I believe at the high school level and the middle school level should be focused more on really a periodization of training, and knowing that athletes who come in from the summer months, this is going to be really something we've never dealt with before. Athletes are likely to come in more out of shape than we've ever seen them before because of the pandemic. And so it's going to be very, very important for you to get the ears and of your coaches, so that athletes are brought in a progressive fashion. Maybe you use something simple for aerobic fitness like the yo-yo test. It's very easy to administer. There's a YouTube video that I looked at before this talk, just to bring myself back up to familiarity with it, because it's not being used a lot in the States. But it's about a gradual progression of workload, and then looking at whatever markers you can for fatigue. Talking to your athletes individually, especially those that are receiving a big workload because of their skill level and importance to the team, etc. And letting coaches know that recovery is a very, very vital part. And I probably didn't answer your question nearly as fully as you might have liked, but I think it's really developing that rapport, trust, so that the coaches allow you to bring them relevant data.
I think that is something that you definitely went through. You said make sure the players understand why you're doing it, the coaches understand why you're doing it, make sure it's easy, it's repeatable, reliable. And that was the biggest question that I had, is what does this look like? Because I just looked up the Ultra G and it's like $35,000 to $75,000. Well, that's like 7-8 years worth of budget, just for one device at my high school, and I think I have a decent budget. And so there are devices like the Compex, the Mark Pro, the Firefly. Are you familiar with those, Dr. Saenz?
No, I'm not, Jeremy.
So basically it's like electrical stimulation. It's NMES, or neuromuscular electrical stimulation. So using those to create a recovery effect, because those are they're cost effective and they're portable. And so devices like those I could see playing into the high school setting more for recovery. But do you know if y'all use those at all in the with the Spurs?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Now when you put the type of technology, the NEMS, certainly something I'm familiar with. And so absolutely, that's a method of mobilizing tissues and mobilizing metabolites within tissues and fluids. So a good method of recovery. But let's not forget simple things like water immersion, and cold water immersions in cold tubs. And let's not forget about simple things like sleep. And so, golly, we look at injuries, and the concussion model has made us think a lot about, what are the other variables that contribute to a concussion? Extrapolate that to musculoskeletal injuries. Did the athletes sleep well enough? Have they been concurrently studying and cramming for exams, during this time frame? Do they have a home situation that's causing them psychological stressors? But going back to the methods of recovery, you do have typically stationary bikes in your rooms, in your training rooms. Maybe you have access to aquatics. Maybe there's a pool that the athletes can use. Maybe you can do group sessions in a pool. Talk to your coaches about things like that as well, as a method of recovery. So, days after games and guys really beat themselves up on a Friday night or Saturday night, that next day is very important recovery day.
one of the big things you talked about too was, I kind of mentioned this, was you bring those numbers back from what you guys are doing the research in, and you can apply that, because you can utilize those RPE scales or questionnaires. One of the easiest things you can do is a questionnaire with your coaching staff, especially, like, let's talk about football during 2-a-days. What was your recovery like? What did you eat? I mean, you can make it as in-depth as you want to, or you can make it as simple as you want. What was your diet like last night when you left here at the training facility, that being a high school athlete or that being a college athlete? How many hours of sleep was that? It's not to get, and knowing, as the sports medicine staff, that's where you're getting the coaches on your side, and them understanding that this isn't a way to get the athlete in trouble, but it's a way to say, hey, we're going to know that we're going to take it back on you a little bit. Or, hey, why is there an issue that you're not able to sleep, or you're not able to do that, or you're not able to get as much sleep? And then especially now with everybody running around with an iWatch, you might not be able to purchase Catapult, but what you can do is you can have them, if they have an iWatch on in there, and you can actually watch the amount of, I'm losing my train of thought on what the other ones were. The ones that just tracked the distance that you walk, or
your Fitbits and so forth.
The Fitbits and stuff like that. So if you've got the wide receiver that, man, they're drained every day because they're taking most of your reps, or they're taking all the time on the practice field. That's something that you can put on and say, hey, coach, let's try to keep under this today. Let's utilize the research that in the professional community that we're able to use, or in the collegiate facilities, because obviously when in my time in the collegiate world, we utilized a lot of that stuff, and adapt it to which you can use in the high school setting or in that smaller world, because you can pull those numbers, or you can pull that information, or you can pull those ideas and use those fatigue numbers that you've talked about, of when their RPE gets to a certain point, that's when their injury risk goes to, because you guys have already done the research for that.
Yeah, those are really excellent points, Shawn. And whether it's the use of the wearables, the actigraphy, and the ratings of perceived exertions, really just doing wellness questionnaires periodically, maybe weekly, is really a very, very good indicator of where that athlete's at, and those that really maybe need a little closer monitoring.
So recently we did a podcast with Carrie Wood about monitoring mental health, and it was basically just a 5-question Google Doc or Google form that she sends out via text message. And so you mentioned something about the psychological well-being of the athletes and them filling out those forms every day. Is that something they do on paper? Is that something they do electronically? And was that accurate, or did I mishear that? Is it every day?
Well, when we have exposure to our athletes on a near daily basis during the course of a season, then it is really on a daily basis. And of course, again, when no expenses are spared, but we're in the age of obviously every kind of app being able to be placed on our phone. So a wellness app has been created for our organization as part of the things that allow us to monitor our athletes. So, but if you don't have that, there's certainly something that can be posted in a training room wall. And you can say, simply on a scale of 10, what's your general feeling of wellness today? It can be something as simple as that. Our athletes can come in and fill out a 4 or 5 response questionnaire that is a psychological or wellness update, and that can be done on an iPad. So any number of means to do it, either by a paper method, or just the regular correspondence when an athlete comes into the training room and they're getting up there to have their ankle taped. How are you feeling today? If you were going to tell me, how'd you sleep last night? What would you say your overall level is? Do you feel happy today? Do you feel kind of grumpy or down? Those are all very tangible things, but again, taking that information and then passing it on, sharing it with the coaching members of the team and coaching staff.
I will say that there are quite a bit of apps that are, or let's just say organizations that are putting out a lot of those questionnaire things that might actually be a part of what Catapult puts out, or what these different, and there are several of those that are budget friendly with regard to, especially if a sports medicine staff wants to implement something like that. It's not extremely expensive. I know at the time when I was at Rice, we were looking at a lot of different ones, and I mean, depending upon the athlete number, it really realistically wasn't expensive, and I'm certain that they've gone down from there. But I've also, as you kind of mentioned, Dr. Saenz, is organizations can put them together yourselves. So, and with student athletic trainers that are very good with apps and computers, I know for I'll say Travis Chipman with he's one of our program managers with Justin Sports Medicine. He's also here in San Antonio. He is he's put together a quick app that we do as we can utilize now as a checkoff on our DOT stuff for driving for Justin Sports Medicine, and you make sure that everything is done. So it's basically our safety check. And he built the app. Now, depending upon the number of people, you may have to pay for it. But what some of those apps can actually do is you can create some that actually text and will actually send a message from whatever number, like a Google number. And by creating that, it sends it, and then you will get the responses back in a form, in like a Excel type document. And you can also utilize it in a shared with each individual athlete, in like a Google Docs or something like that, where their requirement is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they need to get on and they need to fill out their numbers. And if their numbers fall above an 8, it sends you a notification and or it gives you like a red spot, so that you don't have to go through and start looking at everything and everything's clear, and it's very quick. So obviously a little more time consuming, but there's a lot of different ways that you can utilize stuff like that as well.
Yeah, for sure. There's, and the middle school and high school kids can just about get a plane in the air through their phone. So you're right about the applicability there.
You also mentioned pulsed compression and specifically the Normatec device. And is there a reason, or is that just one example? Because obviously there's like recovery pump or rapid reboot or some of the other ones. And so can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the idea, obviously, of mobilization of fluids is the ultimate objective of whether it's a Normatec or XYZ brand. But when you talk about just sequential pulsing, it typically then runs from south to north if you're doing the lower extremities. There's different applications for doing the same thing in a throwing athlete, a pitcher that you want to have. And we know these as former names like the Jobs pump and things like that have always just been a way of mobilizing fluid and trying to restore really homeostasis back to the vascular system, and reducing edema, reducing swelling, and mobilizing what we consider to be deleterious metabolites such as lactic acid, et cetera. But yeah, I think there's other devices that are out there. Things become in vogue, and certainly by the design that you can see that the Normatec has, you can get a 7-footer in those things, and as they're flying from LA to Boston, they can be engaging in some form of active recovery.
We also talked about the secondary setting. So one of the questions is, with these athletes that are still growing, they're not skeletally mature, can they recover too much or too fast? So is there a point where we need to say you can only do one of the recovery devices, or you can only do it for so long because your body still has to continue to grow?
Well, I think that you do always have to individualize treatment, but heretofore the most worrisome thing on athletes that are skeletally immature that are still going through growth spurts really has been more a concern about, biomechanical loads. And then the biomechanicals, or the association of that biomechanical load to the development, perhaps of an overuse injury, an apophysitis or a tendonitis or what have you. I think, though, that there's not any data that I'm aware of that any of the recovery methods employed would have a deleterious effect. Again, I think sometimes, just keeping it simple is oftentimes all that we need to do. And again, looking at sleep as a good recovery method, icing as a recovery method, massage as a recovery method, light aerobic exercise, stationary bike, elliptical, as opposed to pounding, when somebody's just actively running or sprinting. So, keep it simple as best you can. I would not, I'd worry more about not providing a mechanism of recovery to the skeletally immature athlete, as opposed to providing them a method of recovery and worrying about the side effects of that recovery method.
That's fair enough. All right. So, Dr. Saenz, as we wrap it up here, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, find out more, obviously you said you cannot share the PowerPoint in and of itself, but it could be viewed here through the video. How can somebody reach out and get a hold of you?
Well, if you have a mechanism of getting a hold of Shawn Reddy, then you have a mechanism of getting a hold of me. I have him on speed dial. I hope he has me on speed dial. But my email address is if you're ready for it, is SAJockDoc. So SAJOCKDOC@AOL.com. That gives you a little idea of how old I am.
All right. And then Shawn is always Shawn Reddy @_ATC on Twitter. So that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of him there. He's also on Facebook. You can find him again. He says Shawn Reedy, but it is spelled Reddy. And he always says, like, I was born ready. Right. So it's Shawn Reddy _ATC on Twitter. And he's also on Instagram. So you can find Shawn Reddy if you need to. I'm Jeremy Jackson. Again, this course, once it is available on the podcast version, is eligible for CEUs at sportsmedicinebroadcast.com/sportsscience. And then it'll have a link, or you can go to the CEU part of the website as well. So, Shawn, any final closing thoughts?
No, just one thing I wanted to touch on was that Adductor Squeeze test, and I think that was a fantastic. I've actually read the research articles that they've published on that, and I would recommend for everybody to take a look at that, because that's actually something that you can get a lot out of as well in that high school setting, and can find a lot of good stuff from. But nope, all good for me. I'm going to go back to painting.
All right, Dr. Saenz, any final words?
Well, guys, I enjoyed the opportunity to speak with all of you, ladies and gentlemen. And our group here in San Antonio is really comprised of a good group of people that were involved in the education of young doctors and future doctors and athletic trainers in the area. We have a very, very collegial relationship with athletic trainers here in San Antonio and South Texas, and really across the nation. And so just please consider us a resource at any time. You can reach out to me. If I don't know an answer, I'll do my best to get you in contact with either one of my partners who knows the answer, or maybe some colleagues across the country. So enjoy the opportunity to be with all of you today.
All right, thank you very much. So for Dr. Paul Saenz, Jeremy Jackson, Shawn Reedy, and the Sports Medicine Broadcast, that is a wrap. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you, guys.